Hey guys, it's KBRICKS here. I haven't uploaded in a while, but I've got a pretty big video here, probably my best one yet. So, let's get right into it. Ben Shapiro claims climate change is not an emergency, but he couldn't be further from the truth. The simple fact is that the atmosphere has been significantly altered, and the world temperature has risen by 1.2 degrees Celsius, all due to humanity releasing several greenhouse gases into the air. Ben Shapiro, in just one 4-minute video, makes numerous false claims to support his major claim about climate change. First, Ben Shapiro stated that there were only 2 extreme things that can be done to combat climate change, the first of which is to stop driving cars, having kids, using electricity, and to cut down on carbon usage catastrophically. This paints a picture where the average person will have to entirely change their life just to have to equal out climate change, but that's not exactly how it works. Just 100 corporations make up 71% of total greenhouse gas emissions. A great example of how bad corporations are when it comes to climate change is the parent company Procter & Gamble. P&G generates an estimated total of 17.8 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions yearly, which is equivalent to the annual emissions of 3.8 million passenger cars, and they've done multiple examples of what is called greenwashing. Greenwashing is when companies are misleading about how they treat the environment / deal with climate change in general. And so, for example, you'll see misleading things about how they'll treat the environment. They'll exaggerate one example of how they treat the environment, and they'll make lies about how they will treat the environment in their plan. Procter & Gamble have done greenwashing as well. For example, they said that by 2030 they would cut their emissions by 50%, but that is a lie. What they mean is that they'll cut the Section 1 and 2 emissions in half by 2030, which is only this little bit, 2% of their total emissions. So they aren't saying that they're going to cut their total emissions in half, they're going to cut 2% of that in half. So they're basically cutting it down by only 1%. I'm going to pretend to be Procter & Gamble a second here. See this? This chest contains 100 1x1 Lego tile pieces. Oops. I'll make a claim to clean up half of this. Look, guys. So much progress. Oh yeah, and since Procter & Gamble is a parent company, they own a ton of brands that you probably didn't even know they owned. For example, here's just a random wheel of parent companies that are just a few of them that own most of the products that you're gonna know. For example, I just went walking around my house trying to find all the actual Procter & Gamble products I owned, and I was really surprised with what I saw because it was a lot. And it was just the house that me and my mom lived in. What I had thought was just a bunch of different companies is all just P&G. It's literally all just Procter & Gamble, and that is insane to me. Just a few of the companies that Procter & Gamble owns are Bounty, Olay, Pampers, Charmin, Tide, Dawn, Old Spice, Febreze, Crest, Tampax, Gain. There's even more than this. When you see things like this, it's pretty easy to figure out who's actually at fault for climate change. Not the working class like Ben Shapiro tries to claim, because that's what he shows, is that you'll have to limit working class type things because of it. Dawn, which is one of the brands owned by Procter & Gamble, also made a greenwashing ad where they were claiming to just wash ducks to sort of, help the environment, which, does help the environment. These are ducks affected by oil spills, but Procter & Gamble has probably spilled oil on more ducks than it has cleaned. Now, the second idea that Ben Shapiro proposed is to simply adapt to climate change by using things such as seawalls and geoengineering. Those are 2 things he specifically mentioned. So I looked into it a lot more, but I'm only going to really cover the basics in this video. If you want to check out more, just check out the pinned comment down below. It'll have the paper that I wrote about all of this. Seawalls are just walls for the sea. You can literally just see one here. And they're really expensive, and they do have some bad environmental impacts because they disrupt the wildlife and the ecosystem. For example, ducks are commonly abandoned by their mothers and end up drowning just due to not being able to traverse the seawalls. But I'm not really gonna pull out your heartstrings with any more ducks because I'm not Procter & Gamble. a potential solution to all the issues caused by seawalls would be natural seawalls, which are traditionally made of mangroves, as it's just environmentally better and provides a bit more land for the animals to traverse, and actually sort of prevent more of that erosion, which is the point of seawalls. So there's just multiple layers as to why natural integration would be neat. But basically what I'm trying to say is that it isn't the perfect solution Ben Shapiro is trying to say it is. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of details to the situation that Ben Shapiro just leaves out. One of the other things he mentioned is geoengineering, and there's a lot about that. There's just actually a lot, so I'm just going to cover one of them that I researched, which is solar aerosol injection. This is based on the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991, because it sent 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, and this decreased the Earth's temperature by 0.5 Celsius for a year, like an entire year. So the point of this is to put sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, because when it forms with water vapor, it'll reflect some of the sunlight and make it cooler. So people have thought, hey, this is a way to combat climate change, you know? So this is something that they could do yearly, and there's a lot of research that's been done, but the issue is it impacts weather patterns a lot, and there's just a lot of potential issues that could be from it, but there's also a bunch of stuff there. And it doesn't take any CO2 out of the atmosphere. There's a lot of discussion around it, and it's very controversial, but once again, Ben is just oversimplifying something that is a more complex issue and isn't the full solution to the issue. There's a few other forms of geoengineering, such as marine cloud brightening, cirrus cloud thinning, and sunshades, stuff like that, but I'm not really going to get into that. Something that geoengineering reminds me of, actually, since it has to be done yearly and it doesn't actually decrease any carbon, is it reminds me of in Futurama when they have the ice cube that they drop yearly, and it gets bigger every time, and that's just how they combat with climate change. Ben Shapiro made a point that I'm not really going to try and argue with, and that is that carbon emission is the most efficient energy source in the world, but I will say that just because it's efficient doesn't make it good. Extending school or work by 3 hours a day is going to make it more efficient per day, but I don't think anyone would want that. Energy sources are just like such a large thing to change. To quote the United Nations, energy is central to nearly every major challenge and opportunity the world faces today. That being said, in my opinion, there has to be a change. Not just because of the climate impact, carbon dioxide emissions, and other negative environmental impacts, but you also just have to focus on the danger of legitimate human lives in the production of this unclean energy. Accidents in the production of energy are sadly very common, and also very much in the direction of unclean energy. I have a graph for deaths per terawatt hour, and a terawatt hour is a unit of measurement. It's basically enough energy to supply 150,000 EU citizens for like a whole year. Now, this graph even accounts for like stuff like the 171,000 deaths from the Banqiao Dam failure in China, and even so, it only has 1.3 deaths per terawatt hour. So that's just how much legitimate deaths have been caused by these other industries. It also accounts for Chernobyl and all that kind of stuff too. Speaking of Chernobyl, it has really changed the public's perception on nuclear energy. But nuclear energy legitimately isn't that bad. It's almost as good as fossil fuels in terms of energy output, but it produces almost no greenhouse gases. Like, it literally produces less carbon than solar energy. And coal produces over 100 times as much carbon as nuclear. It also requires just less maintenance as some of the other forms of energy, and only needs refueling every 1.5 to 2 years. Even if it's like sort of limited in the same way fossil fuels are, because it's a limited resource, it's still a much better option in the meantime than fossil fuels if we actually want to save our environment. Ben Shapiro later mentioned that people in non-prosperous countries burn dung for fuel, and claimed that eliminating carbon emission would make it worse for them because they have to depend on carbon emissions. And Ben was correct in the first half that approximately 2 billion people do use biomass fuels as their major source of domestic energy, and biomass includes dung. That being said, Ben Shapiro, I don't really think it's the people burning dung that are the people that we really need to focus on cutting the carbon from. Carbon emission has literally tripled over the past 3 decades. I don't think that was from the people burning dung. The US has emitted over 509 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide in its history. The carbon emissions from the US alone are the weight of over 45.4 billion school buses. The United States have emitted over 1 quadrillion pounds just in total. It's actually insane. I'll just skip to the most insane claim that Ben Shapiro made, and that is that if areas flood, it doesn't fully matter because people will just move inland. Like, for example, if Florida floods, people will just move from Florida even if Florida's just submerged, which is insane because Florida has a lot of stuff on that would just be ruined if that happened. And there's also 21 million people that live there, and that would cause mass migration. Which would mean having to find living spaces for these people, having to find enough food, having to find enough health support, having to find enough jobs, which is a lot to have to do. And insane that Ben Shapiro just finds that as an okay result, when the fact that like 10% of this amount of people, like 2.4 million people, moved inland recently, and Ben Shapiro was complaining on Twitter. It's kind of funny, but also just like sad, to be honest, that people are just, believing and following around what Ben Shapiro says when he's so hypocritical on what he says and just so wrong. The final claim that Ben Shapiro makes is that slow-moving crises are not crises, they are problems, not emergencies. 35 billion metric tons yearly is not slow by any means. Global warming is predicted to hit 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. Climate change takes a lot of time to solve. We need to treat it like an emergency to solve it in time. The climate clock, I'm just going to bring up because it's a very famous example for just being a clock that calculates how much time it will take to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming, because that's what many people call the point of no return. There's currently only 4 years left on that clock, which is crazy. 4 more years until we're predicted to reach that. Global warming poses a future threat of extreme weather, species extinction, food scarcity, and more. Global warming is an emergency.